The scent of brewing coffee and sizzling bacon was the familiar perfume of Ruby's Diner, a small, unassuming beacon nestled on the outskirts of a forgotten highway in a town that barely registered on most maps. For Ruby Jones, a woman in her early 40s with eyes that held both deep wisdom and unwavering warmth, this diner was more than just a business. It was the steady pulse of her life. Every morning before the sun had fully kissed the horizon, Ruby was there, flipping pancakes, pouring coffee, and exchanging knowing glances with the handful of regulars who were as much family as they were customers. The diner was her sole livelihood, the wellspring from which all her responsibilities flowed, and the heart of a small, interconnected community that relied on her warmth and unwavering spirit. Ruby herself was a force of nature, resilient, resourceful, and possessing a kindness that belied a formidable inner strength. She was a natural storyteller, her voice a comforting balm as she shared anecdotes and wisdom, each tale as comforting as the diner's famous melt-in-your-mouth apple pie, a recipe handed down through generations from her grandmother. Ruby's days were a relentless rhythm of labor and care, her life a tapestry woven with threadbare hopes and fierce devotion. The diner demanded her constant attention, a demanding mistress that rarely afforded her a moment's peace. Yet, even in the relentless churn of grease and gratitude, Ruby's compassionate heart remained wide open, a wellspring of empathy that never ran dry. One particularly brutal November night, a storm raged, tearing through the sleepy town with a ferocity that shook the very foundations of Ruby's Diner. After securing the last window and sweeping the final crumbs, Ruby stepped out into the howling wind, ready to retreat to her small apartment above the diner. That's when she saw him. A small, scruffy dog, soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably, huddled miserably under the inadequate shelter of the old church's eaves across the street. A deep gash bled sluggishly from its leg. Most folks, battered by the storm and eager for the warmth of their homes, would have hurried past, but Ruby wasn't most folks. Despite her own bone-deep weariness, despite the late hour and the biting cold, Ruby didn't hesitate. She quickly re-entered the diner, grabbing a clean, soft tablecloth, one she had just laundered, and a bowl of leftover stew. She returned to the shivering animal, murmuring soothing words as she gently wrapped the cloth around its trembling body. Back inside the warm diner, she carefully cleaned its wound, fed it, and sat with it, offering quiet comfort until the first light of dawn began to peek through the storm clouds. The next morning, before she even thought of opening for business, she called the local animal shelter and then personally drove the dog there, ensuring it would receive proper care and find a loving home. This quiet act of selfless compassion, performed without thought of reward or recognition, was Ruby's save the cat moment. It wasn't about grand gestures or public accolades. It was a profound testament to her innate kindness, her boundless empathy, and her unwavering belief in the simple, powerful act of caring. Beneath the steady rhythm of Ruby's daily life, a hidden part of her existed, a secret world of ancestral wisdom and forgotten dreams. Tucked away in a worn, leather-bound notebook, she kept her grandmother's treasured recipes, but intermingled with the culinary secrets were detailed notes on natural herbal remedies and poultices, ancient wisdom passed down through generations. Sometimes, when a regular customer was battling a particularly stubborn cold or a persistent ache, Ruby would subtly slip them a cup of a specially brewed herbal tea, its earthy aroma a testament to her quiet knowledge. She never sought attention for these acts of subtle healing, preferring to let the warmth of the tea and the kindness of the gesture speak for themselves. In a faded photograph, carefully tucked into the back of the notebook, was a stern but kind-eyed man in an old military uniform. Her grandfather, a veteran whose quiet strength had always been an inspiration, and always, nestled in her apron pocket, was a worn silver lighter, etched with the majestic image of a soaring eagle, a cherished memento from him. These small, private details, the hidden remedies, the family legacy, the symbolic lighter, were the seed of mystery, hinting at a depth to Ruby that transcended her role as a diner owner, hinting at a quiet strength and a connection to a past that had instilled in her an unwavering sense of justice and compassion. The familiar scent of coffee and frying onions, usually a comforting embrace, now seemed to twist in Ruby's stomach, a bitter reminder of the clock ticking against her. Mrs. Clara, Her elderly neighbor, and the closest thing Ruby had to family, had always been a sturdy oak in Ruby's life. Mrs. Clara, with her gentle wisdom and sharp wit, had been Ruby's confidant, her sounding board, a constant source of quiet strength since Ruby's own mother passed years ago. Now, that strength was failing. The call from the community clinic was curt, clinical. "Mrs. Jones," the nurse had said, her voice flat, "Mrs. Clara Jenkins requires urgent cardiac surgery. Her condition has deteriorated rapidly. Her insurance, it's quite basic. It won't cover the bulk of the procedure's cost." Ruby's blood ran cold. The price tag for Mrs. Clara's life-saving operation was astronomical, a sum that dwarfed Ruby's modest savings. Ruby had immediately drained her meager emergency fund, throwing every spare dollar at Mrs. Clara's mounting medical bills, prescriptions, specialist consultations, preliminary tests. She pushed herself harder at the diner, opening earlier, closing later, stretching every penny. But it was like trying to catch water with a sieve. The small, steady stream of revenue from Ruby's diner, enough to keep her afloat, was utterly insufficient to meet the monumental cost of Mrs. Clara's surgery. A crushing sense of powerlessness washed over her, a deep, gnawing guilt that she, who owed so much to Mrs. Clara, couldn't save the woman who had always looked after her. Days bled into weeks, each one a relentless struggle. Ruby's hands ached from scrubbing griddles, her feet throbbed from standing, but the mountain of debt for Mrs. Clara's care only seemed to grow taller. The doctor at the clinic, a kind but weary man, delivered the final devastating blow. "Ruby," he'd said gently, "we've explored every avenue. Without the required upfront deposit for the surgery, we simply can't admit Mrs. Clara to the specialized unit. Hospital policy is strict on this." The words felt like a physical blow. The unspoken fear that had haunted her dreams now solidified into a terrifying reality. Mrs. Clara might not make it, not because of the illness itself, but because Ruby couldn't afford the cure. This was Ruby's point of no return. The terror of losing Mrs. Clara, a primal, gut-wrenching fear, pushed Ruby to a desperate conclusion. She had to find a solution outside the conventional, outside the bounds of what seemed possible. She was out of options, out of time, and out of money. She would have to risk everything, venture beyond her comfort zone, and embrace a path she never imagined. She would do whatever it took, no matter how audacious or how dangerous, to save the woman who was, in every sense, her family. The aroma of coffee and frying bacon, usually a comforting embrace, was now laced with the acrid scent of suspicion whenever Officer Miller walked into Ruby's diner. A relatively new face in town, Officer Miller was a white man in his early 30s, fresh out of the academy, brimming with an eager, almost zealous commitment to upholding the law. His movements were stiff, his gaze often narrowed, and he possessed a distinct lack of nuanced understanding when it came to the subtle rhythms of a small, diverse community. He had a tendency to jump to conclusions, especially when confronted with anything that deviated from his narrow definition of normal. Officer Miller wasn't malicious, but his inexperience, coupled with an underlying current of implicit bias, made him a formidable obstacle. He was a Type B antagonist, representing the rigid, often unthinking authority of the law, a system that could easily crush the vulnerable under the weight of its own assumptions. He made frequent, unannounced visits to Ruby's diner, his eyes constantly scanning, his presence a palpable chill in the otherwise warm atmosphere. He clearly viewed Ruby's establishment as a potential hotspot, a place that needed to be watched, and his attitude conveyed a thinly veiled disdain for anything he perceived as out of place. Amidst the subtle tension created by Officer Miller's presence, Ruby found quiet solace and unwavering support from her regulars. Among them was Frankie, a grizzled, older truck driver who had been a fixture at Ruby's counter for decades. Frankie was a man of few words, his face weathered by countless miles on the open road, but his eyes held a deep, unspoken loyalty. He would often leave a generous tip, a silent acknowledgement of Ruby's struggles, or offer a gruff but heartfelt word of encouragement when he saw her looking particularly weary. Frankie, with his quiet trust and steadfast presence, was a helper, a small but vital anchor in Ruby's increasingly turbulent world, a reminder that not everyone judged by appearances. The afternoon the Harley-Davidson roared into town was a day etched forever in Ruby's memory. A massive, gleaming Harley, its chrome glinting under the weak afternoon sun, rumbled to a stop directly in front of Ruby's diner. From its seat dismounted a man who seemed to fill the doorway. Tall, with a formidable beard, clad in worn leather adorned with the infamous Hell's Angels patch. This was Hammer, a name that suited his imposing presence. He looked tired, a faint bruise blooming on his cheekbone, and his movement suggested a recent minor injury. Hammer simply wanted a hot meal and a moment of peace, his gaze sweeping the diner with a quiet intensity that belied his intimidating exterior. He hadn't even finished his first cup of coffee when the familiar squeal of tires announced Officer Miller's arrival. The patrol car skidded to a halt, its siren briefly wailing before being abruptly cut off. Officer Miller emerged, his face set in a grim, determined line. He had clearly been following Hammer, convinced the biker was involved in a minor altercation that had occurred in a neighboring town earlier that day. Without preamble, Officer Miller strode directly to Hammer's booth, his voice sharp and accusatory. "All right, you," he barked, his hand already on his holster. "Papers, and what were you doing in Fairfield this morning?" Hammer, despite his fearsome appearance, remained remarkably calm. He slowly reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate. "Just passing through, officer, and I've done nothing wrong," Officer Miller scoffed, his eyes fixated on the Hell's Angels patch. "Right, your kind always says that. I've got a report of a disturbance, and you fit the description. I can take you in for questioning right now." He moved to grab Hammer's arm, his face contorted with a self-righteous certainty. Hammer, though still restrained, tensed, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. He was clearly being judged solely on his appearance and affiliation, not on any actual wrongdoing. Ruby, who had been watching the scene unfold from behind the counter, felt a familiar surge of indignation. She had seen this too many times: prejudice masquerading as law enforcement, judgment replacing justice. She saw the raw injustice, the unwarranted aggression. She also noticed the subtle wince Hammer gave as Miller grabbed his arm, and the slight swelling on his knuckles, confirming he was indeed injured. Without a moment's hesitation, Ruby stepped out from behind the counter, her movements deliberate, her apron still tied around her waist. She walked directly to Officer Miller, her hand, surprisingly firm, resting on his arm. "Officer Miller," Ruby said, her voice calm but unwavering, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that brooked no argument. "You will remove your hand from my customer. He is doing nothing but eating a meal in my establishment. You have no right to harass him, nor to threaten arrest without concrete legal evidence." Her gaze flickered to Hammer's injured hand, then back to Miller. "He is a paying customer, and he is not causing any trouble. If you intend to arrest him, you will need more than just a hunch and a patch. You will need a warrant, or you will need to witness a crime. Otherwise, you are infringing on his rights, and on my right to operate my business without undue interference." She paused, her voice dropping slightly, but gaining an edge of steel. "And if you persist, officer, I will not hesitate to call my lawyer, and I will be filing a formal complaint with your superiors. This kind of profiling is unacceptable." Officer Miller, taken aback by Ruby's unexpected defiance, hesitated, his hand dropping from Hammer's arm. He clearly hadn't anticipated such a direct, principled challenge from the diner owner. Hammer, for his part, looked at Ruby with a flicker of surprise, then a slow, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Ruby had defended him not because she knew him, but because she recognized injustice. She saw a man being unfairly targeted, and her inherent sense of fairness, coupled with her quiet courage, compelled her to act. This was Ruby's unveiling, an astounding, unbidden display of her fierce moral compass and her unwavering commitment to justice, even when facing down authority and defending a man widely perceived as dangerous. She wasn't just standing up for a customer, she was standing up for a principle, revealing the formidable strength that lay beneath her warm exterior. The morning sun, usually a cheerful beacon pouring through the diner's windows, felt cold and unforgiving to Ruby. The aroma of fresh coffee, typically a comfort, now held a bitter tang of anxiety. The incident with Officer Miller and Hammer had shattered the quiet equilibrium of Ruby's diner, transforming her beloved sanctuary into an arena where her very livelihood and Mrs. Clara's life hung precariously in the balance. The very next morning, Officer Miller returned. He wasn't there to arrest Ruby, but his presence was a chilling threat. He strode in, his face set in a grim, self-righteous mask, his gaze sweeping over the few early customers before settling on Ruby. "Mrs. Jones," he began, his voice low but cutting. "That little stunt yesterday, interfering with an officer's duty, that won't be forgotten." He leaned against the counter, his eyes narrowing. "I'll be keeping a very close eye on this establishment. Any little infraction, any minor code violation, and I'll be sure to make things difficult for you. Your kind of business, protecting that kind." He gestured vaguely towards the highway, implying bikers. "Doesn't do well with bad press. Wouldn't want Ruby's Diner to get a reputation now, would we?" His words were a thinly veiled promise of harassment, a direct threat to her only source of income. Ruby felt a cold dread creep into her stomach. He was daring her, threatening to shut her down. Adding to this immense pressure was the phone call from the clinic. Mrs. Clara's condition, already precarious, had worsened. "Ruby," the doctor's voice was heavy with urgency, "we need that deposit for Mrs. Clara's surgery. The window is closing. You have exactly 1 week." The news hit Ruby like a physical blow. 1 week. The thought of losing Mrs. Clara, of failing the woman who had nurtured her, was a torment that eclipsed all other fears. Ruby was utterly, terrifyingly alone in this fight. She had exhausted every avenue, every last penny of her savings. Friends in the community, though supportive, were struggling themselves and couldn't offer the kind of financial help she needed. Now, with Officer Miller's veiled threats, her very means of earning money was under siege. Each day was a grueling battle against fatigue and despair. She worked ceaselessly, her movements mechanical, her mind a desperate hamster wheel of calculations that never added up. The future of the diner, her home, and, more importantly, Mrs. Clara's life, were all precariously perched on the edge of a cliff. The final, devastating blow landed with the brutal precision of a guillotine. A crisp, white envelope arrived from the hospital, delivered by a solemn-faced courier. Ruby's hands trembled as she tore it open. The words seemed to jump off the page, stark and unforgiving. "Due to outstanding balances and the inability to secure the required deposit, Mrs. Clara Jenkins will be removed from the surgical waiting list within 24 hours if full payment is not received." 24 hours, one single agonizing day. Ruby stared at the letter, her vision blurring. A raw guttural cry escaped her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated despair. She imagined Mrs. Clara, frail and vulnerable in her hospital bed, unaware of the bureaucratic death sentence hanging over her. She imagined the quiet, knowing look in Mrs. Clara's eyes if she ever knew Ruby couldn't save her. Ruby felt utterly, completely helpless. She had nothing left to give, nowhere left to turn. No more money to earn, no more favors to ask, no more fight left in her. She walked to the diner's window, the morning light pouring in, illuminating the empty tables and the familiar counter. It was a beautiful, ordinary morning outside, but for Ruby, it was the backdrop to the execution of her deepest love and her most cherished hope. This was her hang by a single hair moment, a desperate precipice where Mrs. Clara's life and Ruby's very spirit teetered on the brink of an irreversible fall. The chill of impending loss permeated Ruby's diner, colder than any winter draft. The hospital's ultimatum, its stark numbers and rigid deadline, had extinguished the last flicker of hope in Ruby's heart. She stood behind the counter, her hands idle for once, her gaze fixed on the empty street outside, a silent tableau mirroring the void within her. This was it, the breathless moment before a final, crushing defeat, the cold quiet where all the fight simply drained away. Suddenly, a sound. Not the familiar rumble of Frankie's truck, nor the unwelcome whine of Officer Miller's patrol car, but a deep, resonant growl that vibrated through the diner's old floorboards. Then another, and another, growing into a symphony of throaty engines. Ruby's head snapped up. Outside, filling the entire parking lot and spilling onto the shoulder of the highway, were motorcycles. hundreds of them, gleaming chrome, roaring engines, and a sea of leather jackets adorned with patches of eagles, skulls, and wings. Among them, pulling to the very front, was a massive Harley, identical to the one that had pulled up days ago. And from its seat dismounted Hammer, the Hell's Angel she had defended. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, standing shoulder to shoulder, were at least 200 bikers, a formidable, silent army. Hammer, his imposing figure framed by the morning sun, strode into the diner, his gaze directly seeking out Ruby. "Ruby!" Hammer's voice was deep, gravelly, but held a warmth she hadn't heard before. He placed a thick, leather-bound pouch on the counter. "Heard you had some trouble. Heard you stood up for what's right." He pushed the pouch towards her. "This is for Mrs. Clara. Every patch out there chipped in. You defended one of us. We look after our own." Ruby stared at the pouch, then at Hammer, then out at the sea of formidable, leather-clad figures. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the sight of the roaring bikes. This was it. The breathless moment of profound, impossible salvation. A few minutes later, the door swung open again, and Officer Miller walked in, his expression a mixture of bewilderment and alarm as he surveyed the throng of bikers outside. His eyes landed on Hammer, then on Ruby. He started to speak, a stern warning already forming on his lips. Before he could utter a word, Hammer stepped forward, his presence filling the small diner. "Officer," he said, his voice carrying surprising authority, "we're here to support Ruby. She's a good woman, and she needed help." He nodded towards the money pouch. "For Mrs. Clara's surgery. Taken care of." Officer Miller's jaw dropped. He looked from the seemingly endless line of bikers outside to the thick wad of cash on Ruby's counter, then back to Hammer. All his preconceived notions, all his ingrained biases, shattered under the weight of this undeniable display of loyalty and generosity. He mumbled something about community watch and maintaining peace, before quietly retreating, clearly outmatched and humbled. He had witnessed a power far greater than his badge. The fierce loyalty of a brotherhood, sparked by a single act of kindness. Within hours, the hospital received a wire transfer for the full amount of Mrs. Clara's surgery. The chief administrator, initially dubious, called Ruby personally, her voice now brimming with deference. "Mrs. Jones," she stated, "the payment has been received in full. Mrs. Jenkins is scheduled for surgery first thing tomorrow morning." Ruby, holding the phone, looked at Hammer, who still stood by the counter, a quiet, almost tender expression on his rugged face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you all." Hammer simply nodded. "You earned it, Ruby. You showed courage when it mattered." He then gestured to the door. "And now, we eat. 200 hungry bikers are ready for some of that apple pie we've heard so much about." The diner, usually quiet on a weekday, erupted into a vibrant symphony of laughter, clinking forks, and the low rumble of contented conversation. Bikers filled every seat, patiently waiting, their tough exteriors melting away to reveal a surprising camaraderie. Ruby, her heart overflowing with an overwhelming sense of vindication and gratitude, moved with renewed energy, taking orders, pouring coffee, her famous apple pie flying off the shelves. Her simple act of defending a stranger had not only saved Mrs. Clara's life, but had forged an unexpected, powerful alliance. The black woman had defended a Hell's Angel, and the next day, 200 bikers showed up at her diner, changing her life forever. The thunderous roar of motorcycles had faded, replaced by the comforting hum of Ruby's diner, now filled with the joyous clatter of plates and the easy murmur of satisfied customers. The impossible had happened. Mrs. Clara's surgery was funded, and the crushing weight of despair had lifted, leaving Ruby with a profound sense of peace. The incident, and the subsequent invasion of the Hells Angels, became the stuff of legend in the small town. Officer Miller, his face still red with embarrassment and bewilderment, found himself the butt of many subtle jokes at the local precinct. His stern demeanor and overzealous approach to the law were dramatically tempered. He stopped his frequent, scrutinizing visits to Ruby's diner, opting instead for brief, almost apologetic waves from his patrol car. The danger he had perceived in Ruby's establishment and its diverse clientele had been unequivocally disproven by the massive, organized show of force by the bikers, a force not of aggression, but of unexpected loyalty and generosity. The incident even led to a small, unofficial community meeting where the town elders gently reminded Officer Miller about the importance of knowing the community he served, rather than judging it from afar. Mrs. Clara's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. The surgery, funded entirely by the bikers' impromptu collection, was a complete success. Within weeks, she was back home, her spirit as sharp as ever, her laughter once again echoing through her small, cozy house next to the diner. Her gratitude towards Ruby was boundless, a quiet warmth that filled the spaces between them. The impact on Ruby's diner was immediate and overwhelming. The story of her defending Hammer and the bikers' incredible show of solidarity spread like wildfire. Truckers, travelers, and curious locals flocked to Ruby's diner, drawn by the legend and the promise of that famous apple pie. Her business boomed, providing her with a financial security she had never known. She was able to hire more help, invest in new equipment, and even start a small savings fund, something that had always felt out of reach. One sunny afternoon, a few months after Mrs. Clara's recovery, Ruby sat at a quiet booth with Frankie, the truck driver, sharing a pot of coffee. The diner was bustling, a testament to its newfound popularity. "Never seen anything like it, Ruby," Frankie rumbled, a rare smile gracing his weathered face. 200 of them, all for you." Ruby smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. "It's funny, isn't it? All that fear, all that worry. And then, kindness comes from the most unexpected place." She looked out at the busy diner, her eyes soft. "I just did what felt right, Frankie. I couldn't stand by and watch someone be treated unfairly." "And that, Ruby," Frankie said, nodding slowly, "is why they came. That's why folks come here. You got a good heart, and people see that." Ruby thought of Mrs. Clara, now enjoying a leisurely afternoon walk in her garden, of the empty chair Officer Miller no longer scrutinized, and of the steady rhythm of the cash register. A deep, abiding sense of peace settled over her. It wasn't just the relief from financial strain, or the absence of fear, but the profound understanding that her simple act of courage, born from a place of fairness and compassion, had resonated far beyond her wildest imagination. This was her new calm, a serenity that flowed not from the absence of challenges, but from the unwavering knowledge that doing what was right, even when it was difficult, had brought an unexpected, profound vindication, and a future brighter than she had ever dared to dream. 5 years later, the once sleepy stretch of highway outside town hummed with a different kind of energy. Ruby's Diner wasn't just a local favorite anymore. It was a landmark, a vibrant hub of community, and a testament to an extraordinary story. And Ruby Jones, no longer just a diner owner, was a respected pillar of the community, her name synonymous with integrity and compassion. The small diner had expanded, a gleaming, welcoming space with a larger kitchen and more tables, yet it retained the cozy, soul-warming atmosphere that was Ruby's signature. Mrs. Clara, now in her late 80s, was a cherished, regular fixture, often holding court at her favorite booth by the window, sipping tea and regaling new customers with tales of Ruby's heroism. Her health, robust after the surgery, was a living testament to the unexpected kindness that had saved her life. The Hells Angels, while no longer arriving en masse, often sent small groups through, stopping for coffee and pie, always with a respectful nod to Ruby and a quiet inquiry about Mrs. Clara. The bond forged that snowy night had deepened into an enduring, unspoken loyalty. Officer Miller, still serving in the town, had undergone a significant transformation. The incident at the diner had been a humbling turning point for him. He was now known for his thoughtful, community-oriented policing, often seen chatting amicably with locals at Ruby's, his rigid judgments replaced by a genuine desire to understand and serve. He had learned that true authority came from respect, not just from the badge. Frankie, the truck driver, remained a loyal customer, often sharing a quiet moment with Ruby, a silent acknowledgement of their shared past and the incredible journey they had witnessed. Ruby, with the diner's soaring success, didn't just expand her business, she expanded her heart's reach. She established the Ruby's Hope Fund, a nonprofit initiative dedicated to assisting local families with unexpected medical emergencies, ensuring that no one in her community would ever face the same desperate choice she once had. She organized annual charity bike rallies, often with a few friendly Hells Angels making an appearance, that drew participants from across the state, raising significant funds for the foundation. The diner also became an informal community center, hosting free cooking classes for local youth and providing warm meals for those in need during the harsh winters. One warm summer evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ruby stood on the newly built outdoor patio of her diner. The air was filled with laughter and the gentle hum of conversation. She was hosting the annual Community Appreciation Dinner, a free event for all her regulars and the town's unsung heroes. Mrs. Clara sat nearby, her hand gently resting on Ruby's arm. Officer Miller, off duty, was sharing a slice of pie with Frankie. Ruby raised a glass, her eyes shining with emotion. 5 years ago, she began, her voice clear and strong, this diner, and my life, faced a storm that seemed impossible to weather. But because of courage, unexpected kindness, and the unwavering belief in doing what's right, we not only survived, but thrived. She looked out at the faces, familiar and loved. This is our second spring, folks. A reminder that sometimes the biggest battles are won with the quietest acts of courage. And that true family isn't always about blood, but about the bonds forged in the fires of adversity. As the celebration continued, Ruby looked around at the bustling diner, at the faces filled with contentment and camaraderie. She saw Mrs. Clara, alive and well, a testament to the compassion that had saved her. She saw the transformed Officer Miller, a symbol of prejudice overcome. She saw her community, stronger and more connected than ever, and she knew, with a deep, abiding certainty, that her simple act of defending a stranger had not just changed a life, but had built a legacy of hope and kindness that would endure for generations. If this story stirred your heart, if it reminds you that courage can alter destinies and that light always finds a path even in the deepest darkness, please leave a comment. Share this story with those who need inspiration. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to never miss upcoming narratives that delve into the profound human spirit and the power of unseen heroes. Thank you for joining the journey.